Thank you. Thank you both for being here. And I'm sitting here listening to the testimony and listening to the questions today, and I wonder how many members of Congress, how many members of this committee have actually been to Hanford, Washington, or to Savannah River Site, or Idaho Flats, or Oak Ridge, Tennessee? How many have actually taken the time to understand what we're talking about today? Because in the production of the nation's atomic arsenal, we use chemical separation facilities, and there's only one chemical separation facility left in the nation, and that is H Canyon at Savannah River Site. Now, Savannah River Site is different than Hanford. Hanford's a closure site. That means we're going to close it down. We're going to clean up the property, and ultimately, it's going to be just a cleaned up site. Savannah River Site has continuing emissions for this nation, and H Canyon is vital. But when H Canyon is operating, there will be waste created that'll ultimately have to be taken out of these tank farms. What we're talking about are tank farms, huge 800,000 gallon tanks, and usually there's what, 12, 15 in a tank farm? 15 800,000 gallon tanks. Those tanks are bigger than the room we're sitting in right now. And so when the plutonium is created for our nation's arsenal, when the stuff's separated away to find the plutonium and use it, this stuff settles out in the tank farms, much like a septic tank, where liquids flow, solids settle down, then the next set, more solids settle down. And so you've got all this stuff underground in carbon fiber or carbon steel tanks, rather. Some of these at Hanford are single wall carbon steel tanks, which are starting to leak. Where does Hanford sit? It sits on the Columbia River. Where does Savannah River Site sit? It sits on the Savannah River. Where does Oak Ridge sit? On the Tennessee River. These are areas that are environmentally sensitive, that could affect a lot of people and our nation's environment had this waste leaked into the soil and ultimately got into the river system and the Columbia River with regard to Hanford. And so Savannah River Site, we have 35 million gallons, came out of 43 tanks. That waste has been vitrified. That means it's been turned into glass. While it was still molten, it actually filled up 10-foot stainless steel canisters. These canisters still sit at Savannah River Site, but they were destined to go to Yucca Mountain. But when we decided we were going to not use Yucca Mountain for its intended purposes, which is the law of the land, that waste, defense waste, still sits at Savannah River Site, along with plutonium that's got to go somewhere that came out of the non-proliferation. And so we've got all this waste. Let's go back to Hanford. Hanford's a cleanup site. They not only had tank farms, they also found a bunch of radioactive material all over the site that had to be taken care of. That waste has to go somewhere. And so there's challenges when you have an 800,000 gallon tank underground to get into that tank to get the waste out. When I was in Hanford in 2008, they were worried about the lid collapsing on the tank, so they were going through 12 and 14-inch pipes into those tanks to try to clean it up. Now, we're talking about solids in there. We're talking about peanut butter paste-like semi-solids. We're talking about salt waste. We're talking about liquids. Liquids are easy to pump out. But how are you going to get the peanut butter type waste out from inside that tank? They were sticking robots down into that tank operating to push that solid up, to semi-solid up, to get it out of that tank. It was a challenge. That's where some of the cost comes from. Finally, they discovered they could cut into the tank, and it's made it much easier to get into those 800,000 gallon tanks to get that waste out. But once that waste has come out at Hanford, it's got to be vitrified. It's got to be solidified so that it doesn't leak into the soil, and whatever capacity we decide to store it in as a nation, we can't have it continuing to leak into the ground. So they turn it to glass. Glass doesn't go anywhere. Doesn't leak into the ground. But these are costs. I'm a fiscal hawk. I really believe we ought to look at every dollar this nation spends. But I believe my constituents and people around the nation would be okay with spending money to get the waste out of these tanks, to keep it from leaking in the Savannah River, to keep it from leaking into the Columbia River or the Tennessee River or wherever it may be, versus a lot of money our government spends on other things. Environmental management, they spent $48.5 billion since 2011. You go back past that for decades, you had stimulus money, ARA money, trying to build vitrification facilities, high waste liquid disposal sites at Hanford to deal with this waste. The liability is $377 billion. I'll guarantee the liability will go up if that waste makes it to the river. It's already in the ground at Hanford in some places having to be cleaned up. So this is a great hearing to talk about the environmental management of this waste that came out of our weapons programs in sites all over this country that are being cleaned up, but also remind it that we're going to continue making waste at Savannah River Site because it has ongoing missions. And how we deal with that waste is something that we ought to continue talking about. And I want to challenge every member of this committee, subcommittee and full committee, to take it upon yourselves to go to Hanford and understand what they're dealing with 800,000-gallon underground tanks and tank farms. Multiple tanks, not just one. Go to Savannah River Site and understand what they're dealing with underground tanks, what they're dealing with H Canyon, its ongoing missions, the waste that will be created then, because this isn't going away as our nation continues to try to be safe in a global environment that we have. And so I thank the department for what you do. And I'm standing in your corner as a member of the Cleanup Caucus to try to help clean up this nation. Now I yield back.